Hello and welcome to another geography lesson. In today's lesson we're going to discuss urban settlements. Now in the previous lesson we discussed rural settlements. Now as you can remember, when we look at rural settlements, it's unifunctional. It's usually only one activity taking place, and that's usually farming or mining. Now we looked at rural settlements. Now let's move on to urban settlements, where we're going to look at the main functions of urban settlements. And that is secondary activities and tertiary activities. Now let's just quickly define settlements again. What is a settlement? It's where people live. Now if you look at urban settlements, there's many activities taking place, not only one activity like in rural areas, but we say it's multifunctional. Very importantly over here, when we combine the two, this is where the product from the rural areas move to this area. Now, in this case, I can guarantee that most of you watching this program probably lives in an urban settlement. And we have different types of urban settlements that we're going to discuss in the next couple of slides. Now, like I've mentioned, the secondary activities taking place, tertiary activities taking place. Let's just quickly go over it again. I've explained it to you in the previous lesson. If you look at primary activities, mining, fishing, forestry, or farming. Secondary activities is the processing. Okay, it's taking the raw material that was being mined and they process, manufacture it into something else. And tertiary activities is selling the product, is services, for instance, schools, hospitals, etc. Now, like I've mentioned before, many of you probably do live in urban areas. Now, it depends. Same as rural areas, we've got classifications of rural areas. So, we also have different classifications of urban areas, like we discussed in the previous episodes. From a town up to a city to a conurbation. Now, in your book, there's an example of an urban area. I will touch sides about the different land use zones. For instance, over here is the CBD, Central Business District. Then just around the Central Business District, you usually find your light industries. Then if you move further away, you got your different residential areas. Residential areas is where people live. We have low income, middle income, and high income. And then on the outskirts, as you can see, where your airports usually are, is where your rural urban fringes is, when you move from the urban areas to the rural areas. Now, exactly the same like we discussed in the previous lesson regarding rural settlements. There's a site, there's a location why people choose to live at these urban areas. Now, very importantly, many cities develop because of a rural activity. The best example I can give you, for example, is Johannesburg. The reason all the people settled down in Johannesburg, because what was found over here? Gold. So the primary activity, the main activity was mining for gold, and that's a rural settlement. But eventually, over time, the function has changed. Now, if you look at Johannesburg, the main functions over here, secondary activities, manufacturing, and tertiary activities, services that's being provided. Now, very importantly, when we choose the site of an urban settlement, we need to look at the following factors, and they are the availability of water. Now, if we're going to get a large population living in an area, settle down in an area, there needs to be water. Now, keep in mind, if we look at urban settlements, we focus on secondary and tertiary activities. Secondary activities, manufacturing and processing. Now, these industries need water to be able to make the company work or the factory work. And because of the factories and because of the services that's being delivered, there's going to be a greater influx of people living there, and obviously people need water on a daily basis. Very importantly, it's not a great concern anymore because of new technology and innovations. Water can be piped and obviously transported to urban areas. Our next factor is soil. Now, the soil needs to be permeable. Now, for instance, people won't choose a settlement where the soil is made out of clay. The simple reason why is because there's going to be no infiltration taking place. And we need good infiltration. What will happen with clay? It will collect on top of the soil and areas will be flooded. Another reason why clay is quite bad is because when you do build infrastructure on it, it can sink and it can crack. Our third factor is rock structure. Now, very importantly, we need to go and look at the different types of rocks that we find when we build our settlements. We can't build it close to sinkholes, it's extremely dangerous. What's a sinkhole? We usually find them close to mining areas. Because of the mining activity taking place underground, the surface can basically fall in, and that's what we call a sinkhole. And very importantly, we're not going to build our settlement close to fault lines where we know the area is prone for earthquakes. And lastly, luckily, South Africa is not influenced by this, volcanoes. Now, obviously, in grade 10, you've learned about the different volcanoes. You've got dormant volcanoes and active volcanoes. Definitely not building a settlement close to volcanoes because it might erupt. Then another factor is relief. Now, put it this way. It's going to be extremely difficult for an urban settlement to grow if it's very steep. Now, for instance, if you look at Lesotho, you will see that most of Lesotho is rural areas because of the mountainous areas. So people choose the settlements usually where the gradient is quite gentle. Now, obviously, if you look at the construction cost for infrastructure, it's going to be much cheaper to build your houses on a gentle slope than on a very steep slope. Now, I'm talking infrastructure, not only houses, I'm talking roads, I'm talking electricity lines, I'm talking water pipelines, etc. Now, many towns do develop because of trade and transport. Now, usually it happens as river crossings. A very good example, for instance, is in Limpopo province, between the border between South Africa and Zimbabwe, and the river over there that people need to cross is the Crocodile River. So people do tend to settle over there, and human factors also plays a major role. Now, especially in African tradition, many people tend to settle because of heritage, because of previous family members, because of ground that they find value in. Now, if you look at the different types of urban settlements, there's three different types: the central places, trade and transport towns, and specialized towns. Now, South Africa do have quite a few of these urban settlements all over South Africa. Now, if we quickly look at the first one, the central place town. A central place town basically provides services, goods and services, to the surrounding rural area. Now, the best example I can give you is Ceres. You know Ceres, the fruit juice that you usually drink? Ceres is a small town that we find in the Western Cape province. Now, Ceres, the surrounding area around Ceres, are being used for farms. There's basically rural areas where farming activity taking place. So the town of Ceres developed to provide goods and services to the surrounding rural area. Now, for instance, basically the market. Basically, what do the farmers in the surrounding area do? They send their produce to the market. Or basically, these farmers need to go and buy bread and milk. They travel quickly to the town of Ceres. Or these farmers need to go and service their cars, their tractors. They quickly travel to Ceres. We're going to look in detail of a couple of more examples. Now, when we look at central places, very importantly, we have different functions. Now, there's two types of services that's being delivered in central place towns: low order and high order. Now, a low order good and service is basically you need it on a daily basis. For instance, bread and milk. And very importantly, we need to keep in mind, how far are you willing to travel to go and buy bread and milk? Not very far, am I right? You just will quickly want to go around the corner, to go to Checkers or Pick n Pay or Spar to go and buy your bread and milk. Same case with a hairdresser. You don't want to travel very far to go and cut your hair. So this type of services we call it low order services or goods. Now, I will come back to this term in a couple of slides, but I first want to concentrate on the high order goods and services. So that is, for instance, we don't need it that much. For instance, let's look at a doctor, a neurosurgeon. A neurosurgeon, you're willing to travel very far to go and see a neurosurgeon. For instance, let's say, for instance, you live in a small town like Vryheid in KwaZulu-Natal, you're willing to drive up to 5 hours to go and see a neurosurgeon in Johannesburg. High order goods are mostly exclusive goods as well. For instance, if you want to buy a Ferrari, the chances are that a central place town will have a Ferrari garage. It won't be possible. Where will you find that? Ferrari garage, for instance, in Joburg, Pretoria, and big metropolitan areas. Now, as you can see, you will only find a few shops or services that can provide the service to you. The trade in transport towns, I will come back in a couple of seconds. I'll come back to the slide in a minute. Now, like I've mentioned, the central place town, it provides goods and services to the surrounding rural areas. For instance, the farming land. For instance, I explained to you series. Now, once again, if you look at the low order goods and the services, for instance, what I've mentioned is bread and milk. You just want to go around to the cafe around the corner or to the spa. You're not willing to travel very far. Now, the threshold population, like I discussed in the previous slide, this is the number of people that rely on the service. For instance, if you look at low order goods, because you need it on a daily basis, you don't need a lot of people to buy from you because people will be returning customers. But if you look at the threshold population for higher order goods, now let's use the Ferrari again. You need a larger number of people because not many people can afford a Ferrari. The same with the neurosurgeon. For instance, not many people need a neurosurgeon. So you need a larger number of people. So in theory, I mean, you can open your Spar or your Checkers in small towns, but you can't practice neurosurgery in small towns. You need a bigger threshold population. You need more people, and people are willing to travel further for this type of service. The same with the Ferrari garage. You are not going to open your Ferrari garage in a small town. You're rather going to open it in a metropolitan area where there's a larger amount of people and people are willing to travel further to get that goods or get that service. Now, if you look at the low order goods, if you look, for instance, at towns, you do find many different shops, for instance, that sells bread and milk. I mean, in a radius of 5 kilometers, you might find a Pick n Pay, a Checkers, and a Spar. But for instance, if you look at high order goods and services, you will only find one Ferrari garage, for example. You will only find maybe a couple of neurosurgeons practicing in a very big metropolitan area. Now, like I've mentioned before, the threshold population is the number of people a function must serve in order to be profitable, or the number of people needed to support a function or town. Now, that's how many customers you need. Now, obviously, with low order goods, you basically need a lot of customers to make profit. But obviously, it's possible because people need that low order services and goods on a daily basis. Now, the range is the distance a person is willing to travel. Now, very importantly over here again, we're coming back to low order services and goods and high order services and goods. I am willing to travel very far to go and buy myself a Ferrari because obviously it's a very expensive car and not many places sell it and you want that service. I will be willing to travel very far to go and see a specialist like a neurosurgeon to get myself better. But I will not be willing to travel far to go and get my hair cut, to go and see a hairdresser, or to go buy bread and milk. So that's the range. How far are you willing to travel to get these goods and services? And once again, it comes to the service and to the goods. Is it low order or high order? Now, the sphere of influence is the area served by business selling a particular goods and service. Now, for instance, the sphere of influence of a pick-a-pay is probably a 5-kilometer radius. It means pick-a-pay will provide the people with low-order goods in a 5-kilometer radius. Now, for instance, the sphere of influence via high-order goods is going to be much bigger. That's probably going to be, imagine a Ferrari garage, probably for the whole of Gauteng, because people will travel far to go and get that product because it's a high-order product. As you can see the definition, this is the area where people live and where they buy their goods from a particular shop. Now, if you think of your local cafe, what's the sphere of influence? It's probably going to be small. Just a couple of streets around it where people are willing to go and buy their bread and milk. But let's say, for instance, you want a HD 50-inch TV and you go to a game store. The game store, what's going to happen? The sphere of influence is also going to increase because people are willing to travel further for that product. Now, trade and transport towns or cities develop because what they do is they take the product. Now, keep in mind, we're still busy with urban settlements. This is where secondary and tertiary activities takes place. Now, what is this? Trade and transport towns make the processing after the finished product easier to transport to the next point. Now, very importantly, settlements do exist where there's easy access to transport routes because it makes it easier to take the finished product and transport it to the next area. Now, very importantly, we've got 3 different types of trade and transport cities. And after the break, I will discuss it with you. Welcome back after the break. So we're basically discussing the different types of urban settlements. So we discussed central place towns. The next one that we're going to discuss is trade and transport towns. Now, we have 3 of them. The first one is a break of bulk settlement. Very importantly over here, it's quite easy to remember. It's when the mode of transport change. Now, Durban is your best example. Now, Durban's got a harbour, so what happens? Goods arriving in one form of transport and it leaves Durban in another form of transport. For instance, let's say, goods are being imported from China. It arrives at Durban. From the harbour, it's getting loaded onto trucks and is then transported to Gauteng. Now, a junction town is usually where 2 main transport routes meet. A good example is the R, is for instance where the N2 highway and the N1 meet or cross one another. And then we have a gap town. It's usually close to a mountain pass. Now, what is a mountain pass? It's basically a road that goes over a mountain. For instance, a very good example is the Dorings, the Hex River Pass, and we can almost say Harry Smith is also a gap town because it's just as you go basically over the Drakensberg Mountains. Just want to continue to the next slides. Our next towns that we're going to discuss is specialized towns. Now, specialized towns or cities has got one main function. Now, these functions may change, and we have quite a few examples of this. Now, there's a dominant function why this town exists. If that function didn't take place over there, the urban settlement or the town wouldn't have existed. Now, in this function, right, it can happen. If this function doesn't take place anymore, it can turn into a ghost town or a deserted town. So it's very importantly that this function keeps on going. Now, the first one is mining towns. Now, South Africa got quite a few of them because we are rich in minerals. Welkom is a very good example in the Free State. Now, what type of mining is taking place over there? Mainly gold mining. Now, that's the reason. Keep in mind, the settlement existed because it was a primary activity taking place. Now, people move to that settlement. More people requires services. Now, all of a sudden, schools starts to pop up over there. Hospital services. Now, shops, people tend to, okay, listen, it's a good idea to go to Welkom and open a shop because I will make money. I will be profitable because people need to buy things. Another example is educational towns. Now, when we think about educational towns, keep in mind we talk about tertiary education most of the time. For instance, Grahamstown, what do we find in Grahamstown? The university. Another example is Potchefstroom. Now, what do we find? We find the Northwest University over there. If it wasn't for the influx of the university, the town will be deserted. Because keep in mind, every single year, an X amount of students go to this town. Now, what happens? These students require food. So basically what happens, the shops are going to sell more products. These students need to buy fridges, for instance, a microwave. So that's kind of basically, if you look at services, that it's basically going to expand. What happens? These students arrive with their student cars, they need to service their cars. So all of a sudden, there's opportunity for a new workshop to open over there. Very importantly as well, if you look at the educational towns, people provide services to these students. For instance, a printing shop, hairdressers. Keep in mind, all of these activities that the students rely on because they move to this town basically 7 to 8 months a year. Then our next specialized town is industrial towns, cities. That's mainly where manufacturing is taking place. Now, a very good example is Sasolburg. Now, you should know by now, Sasolburg is renowned. What do we make over there? It's basically petrol. So many manufacturing activities taking place over there. And if you look at Secunda, where coal mining is taking place. Now, another example is resort towns. And the most popular example I can give you is Margate. Now, a resort town is basically when people go to relax during holidays. Now, not much is happening in these towns throughout the year. But during school holidays, for instance, April, June, and December, there's an influx of people moving down to the coast to go and spend some time for the holiday. And Margate is a great example. So it's a specialized town. So what happens over there? As you can imagine, you will find many restaurants over there because it's close to the beach and people like to wine and dine out in these areas. So it specializes only in tourism. So basically it specializes in people going down to Margate to go enjoy a holiday over December or April or June. Then we have dormitory and commuter towns, very importantly over here. Unfortunately, the reason why these cities developed is because of back in the day apartheid laws. If you look at it, the bylaws, people were not allowed to live in CBD areas, urban areas. So these commuter towns, dormitory towns, developed on the outskirts of cities because they had to carry a pass and they were not allowed to live in the suburban areas. And that's usually on the outskirts of cities. For instance, Soweto, that you will find on the outskirts of Johannesburg. Now, our next topic that we're going to have a look at is the structure of the urban area. Now, what we're going to focus on, we're going to look at the urban profile. Now, and then we're going to look at the street patterns, and we're going to look at the urban land use zones. Now, our urban profile is basically a side profile of an urban area. As you can see, a side view of the urban area. Now, as you can see on the next slide that we have over here, I'm going to use Johannesburg as the example because that's probably our best well-developed urban area in South Africa. Now, right in the middle, we have the CBD. Now, what does the CBD stand for? Central Business District. Now, that's where you find your tallest buildings, residential buildings, and basically businesses. For instance, if you look at Johannesburg CBD, what will you find over there? Anglo-American, most of your big banks like Standard Bank, FNB, these areas, and then obviously a lot of commercial properties like flats, etc. Then we got suburban office parks. Now, this is also known as your outlying business district. A very good example, for instance, Sandton is decentralization of businesses that moved away from Johannesburg CBD because of the decay, because of the crime, and because of prices. So it has moved away, and we will discuss this in detail in the next couple of slides. Now, obviously, if you look at it, you got your low-income housing situated very close to your CBD. When we're going to look at the different models, the reason why it is because back in the day, there was no such thing. There was public transport, but obviously the low-income housing was closest to the CBD so people can walk to work. A transition zone is the movement from the CBD to the suburban areas. Now, for instance, if you look at your suburban areas, what you find, once again, I'm going to use Johannesburg as an example. You've got many shopping centers around Johannesburg, for instance, in the outlying area of the CBD, for instance, Cresta Shopping Center, Rosebank Mall, etc. Then on your outskirts, you got your industrial zones. The reason why in the outskirts, the simple reason why is because of the pollution levels. We're talking about noise pollution and we're talking about air pollution because manufacturing is taking place over there. Your high income residential areas you will also find quite far away from the CBD because people will be able to travel with their own cars to work and back, and because of the property sizes are much bigger. Keep in mind when we look at the CBD, probably the most expensive land values is over there, and that's the reasons why people build up instead of moving outwards. Then we have a rural urban fringe. What do we usually find over there? Our airports. This is basically the end of the urban areas. As soon as you move any further, you're going into the rural areas. Now, when we study our urban profile, we have a look at the density. What does density mean? The amount of buildings in an area. The height of the buildings, like I've mentioned, if you look at the CBD, skyscrapers, very tall buildings, and the land value. Now, kind of makes sense. People build up, not sideways, because it's too expensive. So they'd rather go up. Now, as you can see, the height of the buildings decrease if you move further away from the CBD. As you can see, the height of the buildings are decreasing. The density, the amount of buildings, also decreases from the CBD. Now, you keep in mind, if you look at the CBD, the amount of block of flats over there, once again, if you look at Johannesburg, you go to Hillbrow, the Ponte, there's probably 800, 900 people living in a block of flats over there. So the density, the amount of people also decreases as you move further away from the CBD. Now, the reason why people tend to move away is because of the value of the land. Now, Cape Town, there's a scenario over there. The land is very expensive in Cape Town CBD, and if you look at the property sizes are very small in comparison to the suburban areas. That's cheaper and much bigger. Now, we've discussed the density and the height of buildings. Now, if you think about land values, I'm just quickly going over this again. Now, obviously, closest to the CBD, the land values are the highest. So basically what happens is instead of moving outwards, people build higher. Now, as you can see, the land value decreases as soon as you go out of the city center. Now, there's another urban profile. Once again, you can see the CBD, tallest buildings, most expensive. Then we got the suburban office parks, also known as the outlying business district. Please pay attention to that because that might be a question in your exam paper. Now, it's quite more peaceful. It's not as rushed, it's not as congested. That's the reason why businesses moved out. And we're going to look at the problems that these urban areas experience a little bit later. Now, the suburban shopping areas, like I've discussed, is basically for the surrounding suburban areas where people can quickly go and buy their groceries or go to the movies or go to dine out. The urban rural fringe, like I discussed it with you, is usually where you find your golf courses or, for instance, your airports. Very good example. If you look at Johannesburg again, the rural urban fringe, if you travel to Hartbeespoort Dam, where Lanseria Airport is. And then if you look at your high income areas, it's about the land size, massive property sizes, people with swimming pool, tennis courts, and big grounds and massive houses. The low cost housing, obviously high density, very small property sizes, and basic services that's available close to them around it. The transitional zone is the area around the CBD, very old buildings, usually run down. You will find your light industries, what we will discuss in our next lesson. It's where textile industries are taking place, where there's a lot of unskilled labor available for these industries. And then our industrial zones, usually on the outskirts, because of the amount of pollution taking place, noise and air pollution. And very close to transport roads to basically transport their products to different parts of the countries. Now, our next topic that I'm going to discuss with you is urban street patterns. Now, grade 12s, please pay attention to this section because this might apply to your map work paper as well. Meaning, if they give you a topographical map of, let's say, a town of Paarl, they might ask you to identify the street pattern and give some advantages regarding the street pattern. And we're going to have a look at the different street patterns in the next couple of slides. Now, the layout, how the roads looks. The street patterns are how the roads basically look. Now, keep in mind, this is from a topographical point of view, from above. Now, our first one that we're going to have a look at is gridiron. Now, it's very simple. It looks literally like a gridiron. Now, you will see that most of South Africa's massive cities, CBDs, have gridiron patterns. Just want to get to the slide quickly. If you look at it, it's usually found in the CBDs and all the cities. What's the advantages of it? The simple reason why it's the oldest, it's very easy to find your way around. There's many one-way streets that you will find, and the land can be divided up much easier. I mean, for instance, per square, it's much easier to divide the land, and it's very easy to find the place that you're looking for. It can be converted into one-way streets, like I've mentioned. And what does it do? It eases the traffic. It doesn't cause traffic congestion. Okay, keep in mind when we talk about congestion, it's because of there's too many cars in an area, and it causes traffic problems. And another factor, especially when you look at the CBD, little wastage of land. Now, what we've seen in the previous couple of slides, that land is very expensive in the CBD, the value of the land. So basically, little wastage of land. We're not going to spend a lot of surface area on roads because of this gridiron pattern. Now, the disadvantages, it depends on the amount of people. It can cause congestion because of the stop-start and because of the one-ways. There might be more accidents at the intersections, especially when the robots will be out. And it's not very exciting. It's quite boring. So it's not very interesting. It's one ways to the one way. It's just one ways up and down the street. But once again, very importantly, when we look at this gridiron pattern, we know it's easy to find your way around it. After the break, we'll quickly look at the next couple of street patterns. Welcome back after the break. Now let's quickly continue with the different street patterns. Now we discussed the gridiron pattern. Now if you look over here, there's a perfect example of it. As you can see, it looks like a gridiron. We will find it mostly in the CBD and mostly one ways to avoid traffic congestion. But as you can see, it's quite boring, but still very important because it's found in the CBD and it doesn't use a lot of space, and because land is so expensive over there. If you look at radial street patterns, it's moving outwards. Now many towns have a radial pattern, for instance Stellenbosch, and Kimberley is another example. It looks like a spider web. Now Paris is a very good example. If you look at a global city, it's from the Eiffel Tower outwards. Now if you look at the advantage of it, it makes traffic much easier, so it can avoid traffic congestion. All the roads lead to a central point in town because basically, let's say for instance, it's radial, it's outwards, so it doesn't matter if you travel towards the central point, everyone will get to the same point. The disadvantages, it can cause traffic jams, and the traffic is quite slow because of the curved roads. Now there's the example of a radial street pattern. As you can see, everything leads to the central point, and this central point might be a historical monument or it might be a church. Our next street pattern is a planned irregular street pattern. Now there's very few intersections and it curves a lot. Now the reason why people tend to use this pattern is when the gradient is not that gentle, when it's quite mountainous or it's up a slope. The advantages of it, now many modern cities that develop uses this pattern. It improves the flow of traffic. The roads are quieter because there's fewer intersections. And it's interesting. It makes it interesting to see, to travel. And very importantly, probably the most characteristics over here is accommodates the nature of the topography. So if it's a steep area, let's say for instance this town or city is developed in the valley area, this is the type of street pattern that they will use. The disadvantage of it, it's easily to get lost and it's very easy to expand. Now if the urban area had to expand, it's going to be very difficult to expand this street pattern as well. As you can see on this diagram, planned irregular pattern. It's mixed shapes and sizes, especially in suburban areas, but very importantly over here, we can use it on places that's quite uneven. Our last one is unplanned irregular street patterns. Now the reason why they develop is because it's when suburban areas or urban areas just develop over a very short period of time. Not a lot of thought went into developing street patterns because of all the sudden increase of people and urban settlements that pops up. And that's the case of informal settlements over there. What's the advantages of it? It's unique. It's not boring. It's got twists and turns everywhere. Disadvantages of it, traffic congestion. There's no flow because no one did the proper job planning it. And you can get lost very easily. For instance, in informal settlements like townships where there's a lot of shacks. And as you can see, there's no regular pattern. It's all irregular, and you can just imagine getting lost quite easily over there. Now, we've looked at the different urban land use zones when we look at the urban profile. Now, what I've added here is some photos because many of you might come from rural areas or very small towns. This is your central business district, like I explained it to you. Skyscrapers, massive buildings. The reason why we're going up because of the land value, and there's an orthophoto map of a CBD. As you can see, very important, please pay attention. Look at the gridiron street pattern that we see over here. See that? Okay. This transition zone is just surrounding the CBD. Okay, it might be commercial, be used for commercial areas, commercial by selling products and that, making shops, or it can be used for residential areas. It's usually the zone of decay. We'll discuss it, where slums are. Simple reason why it doesn't look very good. A lot of crime activity taking place over there. And it's usually the working class residents living over there. The property sizes are very small. It's usually apartments and flats or very small property sizes. Now, if you look at the light industries, you usually find it just on the outskirts of the CBD as well. The reason why we allow it, because it doesn't cause a great amount of pollution, noise pollution and air pollution. It's very close to the CBD and it's close to the transport networks to basically take their product to different areas. As you can see over there, heavy industries like we discussed before, usually on the outskirts of the urban areas. Why? Because of the amount of pollution that's being created and because noise pollution and air pollution, and very importantly, close to transport networks so they can take their product and deliver it to other parts of the country. And very importantly over here, it needs to be on flat land. And if you look at the reason why we chose these locations, because there needs to be availability of water, because they use the water to basically make their products. And as you can see, often low-income housing is also found close by because you need unskilled workers to work in these industries as well. Now, our residential areas is where people live. Now, we can divide them up in middle to high income. Basically, middle and high income, you look at the property sizes, you look at the property value and how big the properties in the houses are. It's usually far away from the CBD because people don't want to be stuck and be close to the congestion of the CBD and the amount of pollution over there. And usually have good views, usually built on a conical hill or such. The house sizes are quite big, and if you look at the property stands are quite big as well. And if you look at the surrounding areas, you usually find shopping centers, quite nice shopping centers that surrounding these middle and low income areas to provide them with services. The low income areas, once again, the stand sizes, very small, unfortunately. Obviously, it houses the poor people and the buildings look very much the same. And informal settlements. Now, Gr112, once again, do not get confused between the difference between rural areas and informal settlement. The informal settlement is a settlement where people live but it lacks basic needs and services. It's usually your shacks. The materials that you use is plastic, wood, and zinc. The conditions are unhealthy because there's not proper sewage. There's probably not enough running water. High poverty levels. Okay, that's our informal settlements. The reason why they develop on the outskirts of urban areas is because people are migrating from the rural areas to the urban areas. Now, our greenbelt areas, for instance, are parks for recreation. Now, people go there to just go and relax. And they are quite important because what do? They reduce the amount of pollution and they help cleanse the air and it reduces the noise level. And lastly, like we discussed, the rural-urban fringe is mixed land use, right? It's usually where the airports are or golf courses are. And there's very large property sizes over here and there's less developed areas, such as building and infrastructure taking place over there. Now, our next topic that we're going to have a look at is our land use models. Now, unfortunately, these land use models were based on our urban areas a long time ago. And over time, this land use models has changed its shape because the influx of rural-urban migration and because of the land use, how people use the land in the urban areas. Now, this is just a simplification, just to show you the basis of how towns and cities were developed according to land use zones. Now, the land use models we're going to have a look at is the multiple nuclear model. The modern American Western city model doesn't actually apply to us. Third world city models, that's for instance South America and most of Africa, and we're going to look at the South African city model. That's quite unique because we're coming from an apartheid era and our cities was developed according to the apartheid laws. Now, most of our cities today is multiple nuclear models. What it basically means, we don't only have one CBD, but we have outlying business districts as well. Johannesburg, once again, a great example. You got Johannesburg CBD, and then you have Sandton. Durban is a very good example as well. You got your Durban CBD, and then if you move further away, you go to Umhlanga. That's an outlying business district. Now, the examples I want to show you, over there you can see the American Western city models. Please pay attention to the keys. That's your CBD over there. That's your outlying business districts over here. And as you can see, the light grey is your manufacturing, light industries taking place. But most of our cities are based on this model over there, the multiple nuclear model. As you can see, there's your CBD. If you look at the urban profile, very similar to that. You got your light industry surrounding the CBD, then you got your low-class residential areas closest, that's the zone of decay. Your high-class residential areas, as you can see, your heavy industries basically on the rural-urban fringe because of the amount of pollution. There's the outlying business district, and there's your middle-class residential areas. Outlying business districts is where other provide services outside of the CBD because the land is cheaper and it's less congested. Now there's an example of third world countries. As you can see, your CBD right in the middle, your low income closest to it, your industrial parks furthest away because of the amount of pollution. And as you can see, your different income residential areas. But if you look at South Africa's model, and I want to highlight it over here, the apartheid government created buffer zones. Now, as you can see, the buffer zones over here, it might be roads, it might be railway lines, it might be green belts, it even might be a river. Now, these buffer zones was created to separate the black and the white people from one another. As you can see, there's the middle income white groups, high income and middle income. And separated by a road or railway was your colored areas and your African townships where the black people used to live, and your colored and Indian residential areas. And as you can see, the low income for white people was closest to the CBD. So they created these buffer zones to separate people according to race. Now, unfortunately, because of rural-urban migration, we experience a lot of settlement problems. Now, keep in mind, there's a great influx of people moving from the urban areas to the rural, from the rural areas to the urban areas. And that causes problems for urban areas and very often for the CBD. So let's quickly have a look at these problems that we experience. Congestion, urban decay, and centralization. That's the three main common problems that we experience with rural-urban migration because of the influx of many people to urban areas. Now, if you look at congestion, biggest concern over there is the amount of cars on the roads. Unfortunately, cars create pollution and it makes the environment dirty. Now, there's too many people using their own cars, not enough public transport systems, and the all street planning. And what does it do? It creates pollution. More cars means more accidents. And obviously, it causes stress, road rage. I believe you've seen it definitely somewhere in your lifetime in South Africa. Now, obviously, there's solutions for it. Improve our public transport system. I mean, how many people can fit on the bus? Probably 20, 30 people. Immediately, one bus eliminates 30 to 40 cars. Okay, use lift schemes, for example. Carpooling, that's how it works in America. If, let's for instance, why do people need to drive their own car? Let's make turns and carpool together, drive together to work. Okay, very importantly, because of the major influx of all the congested, that's the reason why outlying business districts developed. Many companies decided to move away from the CBD because it's too congested, too many people over there. And very importantly, synchronize the traffic lights so that the traffic can flow much easier. Now, urban decay is a massive problem, and the main cause for that is property owners not looking after their properties. Now, it's usually the CBD when it moves into the residential areas, the fringe of the CBD, and basically there's too many people. There's not enough space for everyone living in the CBD. So what happens? Unoccupied buildings, the people don't pay rent anymore. There's no landlords looking after the place, maintaining the place. So what happens? Slums develop. Now the services and facilities decline. Most of the time there's not even running water. The area becomes dirty and neglected. Now what can people do? The owners need to take ownership of the building. They need to pay levies. They need to collect rent and to look after the place, make it more adaptable and better looking for the surrounding area, and improve the services and the facilities. And centralization. Now, unfortunately, because of the rural-urban migration, there's a high demand for land in city areas, but already there's too many people living in the urban areas. Now, keep in mind, it puts strain on services. For instance, garbage collection, water, electricity. And what does it do? It increases the pollution, increases health problems. It's destruction of the environment. Now, many greenbelt areas can't survive because of the amount of pollution taking place and the amount of garbage that's being created by the amount of people. Now, what's the solutions that we can do? Decentralization. Take some of these businesses away from the CBD. Now, obviously, stricter control, bylaws, and even fines on people that pollute, and definitely create more green areas, green belts like parks, plant more trees where people can go and relax. It's going to reduce the noise pollution as well. So basically, what we've looked at in this area, we looked at the types of urban settlements that we've just discussed. Now keep in mind, once again, it's where all the secondary and tertiary activities taking place. And then we look at the urban profile from the CBD to the rural urban fringe and your different residential areas. And then we look at our urban street patterns. Very important, keep in mind, you might get this in your map work paper. Remember, you need to be able to identify it and give some advantages and disadvantages of the different street patterns. And lastly, we looked at our land use models and the problems that we experienced in urban areas. Thank you for watching and see you next time.